Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another stream. It's Danny Dhaiphong, your host, and I am joined today by two very special people and workhorses in the movement. We have Margaret Kimberley, the executive editor of Black Agenda Report, and we have Dr. Gerald Horne, who's a renowned historian, prolific author. He is the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. And he has a new book, which you can find. He has many books. He has many books, but you can find his latest offering, Acknowledging Radical Histories, a series of his interviews, in the link in the video description. Welcome, both of you. Thanks for joining the program today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course, of course. Well, perhaps we can start with the latest developments on the African continent. Dr. Horne, maybe I could kick it to you because I know you've been studying the history of liberation movements in Africa, the history of colonialism, settler colonialism in Africa. Now we have the developments on the continent in the news quite frequently, especially when it comes to the latest coup in Niger. Back in July, where the French-backed government was overthrown. And now there are developments where Russia's foreign intelligence services is saying that the U.S. and its allies are planning a potential assassination of that government that has taken power there. There's been a lot of developments happening in between July and this news, with Niger moving to kick out French troops, summoning and attempting to arrest the French ambassador for failing to leave the country upon their requests, raising the price of uranium, and so many other developments. Dr. Horne, can you help us understand what's been going on here from maybe a historical perspective, and where does this development in Niger, and I know there's been a coup in Gabon recently, but there's been a lot of developments in this part of Africa, the Sahel, that have troubled, it seems, the Western world, France in particular. Could you help us understand what is going on from a historical perspective and where you feel like it fits globally in the balance of forces worldwide?
Well, briefly, what's happening historically is that the neo-colonial powers, particularly France, they have been all too adept at destabilizing movements, parties, individuals that had been pushing for redistribution of the wealth. And in the resultant vacuum, which you see emerging is the point that oftentimes the only institution left that might have the mettle and the strength to challenge the neocolonialists has been the military. And B, the ideological vacuum to a certain extent has been filled by religious zealots who are on the march in northern Nigeria, on the march to a degree in Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali. Note that those latter nations all have basically had regime changes in the last few years. Now, historically, let's start with Guinea-Conakry on the west of the continent, which too has had a regime change, a so-called coup d'etat against the civilian authorities. Recall that in 1959, 1960, when that West African nation was surging to power, not at the behest of France, you saw that France did everything in its power to try to sabotage the resultant independent Guinea-Conakry, up to and including evacuating with typewriters, light bulbs, wrecking toilets, etc., because they wanted the regime of Sékou Touré, who was a comrade of Kwame Nkrumah in neighboring Ghana. France wanted that regime to get off on the wrong foot so that any other regimes that were considering the progressive measures that Sékou Touré had contemplated, and recall that he came out of a trade union background, a postal worker background, in fact, had a kind of working class orientation. And I dare say that it's possible to suggest that Guinea-Conakry has hardly recovered since that destabilization. Or if you look at Mali, for example, they had a leader in the early anti-colonial days of about a half century ago or more, Modibo Keita, who was, as suggested, in the fashion of Sékou Touré. He did not meet with a pleasant end. And so what you see is the inevitable result of these kinds of destabilization efforts, which then brings us to Niger, which is staring down the barrel as we speak of a possible military intervention spearheaded by the Economic Community of West African States, led by Nigeria, the continent's largest economy. Recently installed President Tinubu is under pressure from the United States, not least because President Tinubu has more than one skeleton in his closet. I recommend to your audience not only the robust media of Nigeria, but also in particular the progressive filmmaker David Humdeyin, Humdeyin, who's done considerable research on President Tinubu, who formerly was a student in Chicago. And according to his documentary that he did about the current Nigerian president, he was involved in a kind of Pan-Africanism that would not have pleased W.E.B. Du Bois. He was collaborating with Chicago's so-called street gangs, mostly of African-American youth, with regard to drug dealing, with regard to money laundering. And supposedly, Mr. Tinubu, when he left the United States, he fled so hurriedly that he left $500,000 on the table in a civil forfeiture. Now, when the Niger coup occurred a few weeks ago, late July 2023, it's interesting to note that it was quickly followed, according to the Nigerian press, by phone calls from Vice President Harris. And it's suspected that she was waving the sword of Damocles over President Tinubu's head, that is to say, suggesting that if he did not dance to the Yankee tune, perhaps more documents could be released to David Humdeyin, because he's in court right now as we speak. In the United States, the Illinois courts or the federal courts are suggesting that it may take a couple of years to sift through all the documents. I dare say that if he doesn't play ball with Uncle Sam, the documents probably will be released tomorrow. So this is the state of play. There's a lot of pressure on Niger, not least because it is a uranium supplier to France, supplying uranium for nuclear plants that then powers French electricity. I think you mentioned in your opening remarks that they're trying to raise the price of this valuable commodity which then will probably have knock-on effects in terms of raising the price of French electricity to the detriment of President Macron. There's also in motion a pipeline being built from Nigeria through Niger to Morocco into Southern Europe, supplying natural gas in light of the boycott of Russian natural gas that puts a premium on African natural gas. In fact, I think it's difficult to understand all of these changes that are taking place in these countries which we're referencing without understanding the knock-on effects of the escapade in Ukraine, which has led to this boycott of Russia, which then puts more pressure on African countries to fill the vacuum left by the boycott of Russian commodities. Speaking of Russia, I think it's also important to note that in terms of the context, the wider context of what's going on and why we probably have not seen the last regime change in Africa, I didn't bring my crystal ball with me this evening, but one does not have to be a seer and oracle to suggest that in Cameroon, 90-year-old Paul Biya, in office for about 4 decades, has one foot on a banana peel. You can say the same thing for Teodoro Nguema in Equatorial Guinea, one of the few Spanish colonies on the continent. Oil-rich Equatorial Guinea, Marathon Oil of the United States, plays an outsized role in that economy. He's been in power since about 1979 when he overthrew his uncle and seized power. Once again, the wider context is the rise of the Brics: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, or as some might have it in the Black community, CRIBS: China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, which actually might be more logical in terms, I'm afraid to say, of the importance of the players. That is to say, with the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, South Africa, a few days ago, and the extension of membership applications to Egypt and Ethiopia and Saudi Arabia, Iran, United Arab Emirates, and Argentina, it's clear that off stage is a potent rival developing to the North Atlantic powers plus Japan. And I think that in light of the role of South Africa as well, which is playing a role, its internal problems aside, with regard to a kind of ideological leadership or blazing a trail for other African nations to follow, African nations recognize that there is an option, there is an alternative to the World Bank, there is an alternative to the International Monetary Fund. There is the BRICS Bank, for example, capitalized in the billions. And unlike the World Bank, which exists upon structural adjustment, if they extend capital, that is to say, you have to wreck your education and healthcare system and admit in the pirates, the piratical behemoths, corporations from the North Atlantic if you want a loan. The BRICS does not operate in that fashion. That makes it a very positive alternative. It's putting pressure on the World Bank to act similarly. In fact, you might have noticed that at the G20 meeting in New Delhi, not only was there an application extended to the African Union to turning the G20 into the G21, that's a direct result of the pressure from the BRICS. And likewise, with regard to the Belt and Road Initiative of the People's Republic of China seeking to build this infrastructure, not only in Africa, but in the tricontinental region, that is to say, Africa, Europe, Asia, Washington has come up with its competitor to the Belt and Road involving India, for example. So it's important for your audience to recognize that China and the BRICS are putting extraordinary pressure on the North Atlantic countries, and they're trying to respond. You saw that President Biden was just in Vietnam only this week, in fact, trying to complete an encirclement of China, which he denies is an encirclement. And likewise, your audience should keep a close and careful eye upon these military maneuvers that NATO will be embarking upon within a few months, perhaps the largest since the collapse of the Soviet Union, obviously targeting Russia, because despite the fact that this escapade in Ukraine of NATO is backfiring, These military maneuvers suggest that Washington has not given up on the idea of getting to China by first marching through Moscow. Although the alternative party, speaking of the Republicans, their idea instead is to cut a deal with Russia before marching towards China. So those are the two alternatives of the two bourgeois parties. The question is, what will the progressive and radical movement propose as an alternative? And certainly this kind of discussion about what's happening in Africa is a step forward in that direction.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. You mentioned ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and the role that they are now being asked to play by the U.S. Against Niger. The President Tinubu, who you've mentioned before, they've announced that when the UN meets in New York in about a week, that he will have a face-to-face meeting with Biden. In the past, I recall during the last African summit, the ability to have FaceTime with Biden was those were few and far between. But the U.S. is involved itself in this. They sent Victoria Nuland, the new Deputy Secretary of State. She went directly to Niger, demanding that the president, who was deposed under house arrest, that he be freed, and so on. So there has been a lot of, as usual, U.S. interference or attempts at interference in that region, although there's pushback in that region as well. Nigeria so far has gone along to some degree. They cut off electricity to Niger, the neighboring nation, and sanctions against Niger. So this is I don't want to say it's a new development. It's what the U.S. Has always done. But this very direct effort to get African states to turn against another, being so public and being so ham-fisted, but that's what Victoria Nuland does, right? Is something that's of interest, I think, to our listeners and viewers. What do you say about these events?
Well, with regard to Nigeria, first of all, a military intervention spearheaded by Nigeria into Niger would be opening the gates of hell. Keep in mind that Niger has been trained to a fairly well by French and U.S. forces. Keep in mind as well that there is a lot of intercourse along the northern Nigeria border into Niger. I've noticed that with regard to Nigerian media in particular, many of those who are raising strident objection to a possible intervention happen to be Hausa, that is to say, from the north of Nigeria. And of course, their sisters and brothers are across the border in Niger. They speak the same language. Oftentimes, the folks are trilingual, that is to say, speaking not only Hausa, but English and French, given the colonial borders. And so some sort of intervention would be quite disastrous. Many in Nigeria are wondering, well, what about Boko Haram? Recall, these are the religious zealots that I made allusion to a few moments ago, who specialize in kidnapping teenage girls, who I'm afraid to say have been supported under the table by many in the Persian Gulf region. Their wielding influence is quite disastrous. Many in Nigeria are wondering, why not focus on Boko Haram more so than dance to the tune of Uncle Sam by spearheading a military intervention into Niger? And I should also mention in that context that President Bazoum, who has received favorable publicity on this side of the Atlantic, now under detention, is from a minority in Niger. He's of Arab ancestry. The French colonialists, like their British counterparts, often try to rule through minorities. And I should also mention there's a wider dimension, because if you go to a number of West African states, particularly those that were formerly French colonies, you'll find, I'm afraid to say, and even Nigeria for that matter, you'll find many Arab compradors who have a close relationship with France. In fact, Haiti, a former French colony, you find the same sort of thing. And so what's happening now is that that whole neo-colonial setup is being challenged. But the part of the problem is that some of these compradors are very well endowed. Some of them have connections, in fact, to the Clinton Foundation, for example, particularly those in Nigeria. So this is a very dangerous situation, and it's taking place in another context that needs to be focused on. Of course, is already referenced, the rise of China, the Brics, etc., which is providing an alternative path of development for many African countries, helping to spur on these regime changes. And then secondly, I would mention the contradictions between France and the United States. Certainly since the Suez intervention, to return to your point about history, Danny Dhaiphong, since 1956, when you had the ill-fated French, British, Israeli piratical attack on Nasser's Egypt over control of the Suez Canal, recall that Moscow forced those pirates to stand down, but President Eisenhower felt compelled to move in a similar direction, which outraged France. And ever since that time, you've seen a foreign policy whereby London has tried to tie its April strings to Uncle Sam, and France has tried to embark on a more independent path, including, you may know, even making an application to join the Brics, which was turned down, understandably. But also recall that in 1959, when then Senator John F. Kennedy was running for US president, he was quite critical of the French intervention in Algeria, which of course culminated in independence in 1962. That led to the misperception that he was some sort of anti-imperialist, but actually what he was trying to do was elbow France aside so that US imperialism could step into the void. And you still have that taking place, because in Niger, for example, I found it curious that after Victoria Nuland had what she described as these difficult sessions with the new regime in Niamey, the capital of Niger, that the United States parachuted in a new ambassador. This is a country that, as you know, in the United States has been lethargic in appointing ambassadors to strategically cited countries. There have been raucous demonstrations at the French base in Niger. The United States has a major drone base in Niger. Not so much have we seen demonstrations there. And so because the situation is so fluid, and because Niger is under so much pressure with electricity blackouts, with inflation spiraling in light of the Nigerian sanctions, we have to keep an eye on what Uncle Sam is contemplating for these countries. That's the least we can do, because we do not want to face a situation where French neocolonialism is supplanted by US neocolonialism. And that's certainly a danger in Gabon, which you mentioned in your opening remarks, an oil-rich country of about 3 million. You know that the Bongo dynasty ruled for about 56 years up until a few days ago. Interestingly enough, the new leader of the regime, Nguema, carries, for what it's worth, the same surname as the leader of neighboring Equatorial Guinea. But more relevant is the point that he is a major property holder in Silver Spring, Maryland, and Hyattsville, Maryland, which many in the international community are looking askance upon, because once again, it raises the specter of French neocolonialism being supplanted by US neocolonialism. Likewise, just a few weeks ago, right after the regime change in Niger, there was a front page article in the Wall Street Journal talking about a leader of the junta in Niger who was trained at the National Defense University, hard by the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. The Wall Street Journal front page article suggested that we thought he was our guy. In fact, they said he still might be our guy. I'm not sure if that was put in the newspaper to sabotage him and to sandbag him, but there it was. And of course, he has close ties to the United States as well. So that is something we have to watch. And going back to Gabon, we also have to watch whether or not the Total, the French oil giant, which now has a stranglehold on Gabonese oil, will continue to do so, or will it be challenged by Marathon Oil, which is noted as a stranglehold on oil in Equatorial Guinea. Likewise, we have to study the fate of an opposition leader by the name of Jean Ping. That surname may ring a bell because Jean Ping, who also is very highly respected at the African Union, which he almost once headed, has a Chinese father and a Gabonese mother, and that is viewed with alarm and suspicion in Washington because they feel that he may be all too close to Beijing as a result of his ancestral heritage. I haven't heard a word from Jean Ping since the coup, although to its credit, the regime has freed political prisoners. But once again, I think that if we in the progressive and radical community are going to be helpful to our brothers and sisters on the continent, the least we can do is to unmask the charlatans, to keep an eye on Uncle Sam and its evil ways, and then spread the word the way we're doing this evening.
Yes, yes, indeed. I mean, all of that was critical history, and perhaps you could talk more about you mentioned the conflict in Ukraine. I mean, this is what most people who are following global developments, regardless of their where they sit on the political spectrum, where their attention is drawn to. But I find what's so interesting about this moment is that this conflict, often portrayed as Russia versus Ukraine, or as the Western powers like to say, Russia invading Ukraine, it's had this huge impact on the world. And as you said, it's had a monumental impact on politics and developments on the African continent. Could you speak to just how much and where has this conflict kind of taken the world, and how should we be looking at it? Because I think what's really difficult at this moment is the incessant propaganda from the Western mainstream media trying to kind of isolate this conflict as Russia's problem, as Russia's doing without any provocation. But we are seeing more and more and more that this conflict is changing the world in immense ways, and NATO's role in all of this has a huge part to play and is huge in these developments. So I'll kick it back to you, Dr. Horne, before we get to Margaret.
Well, look, first of all, at the statement coming out of New Delhi at the G20, which was boycotted by Xi Jinping of China, President Putin of Russia. But having said that, Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia was quite pleased with the G20 statement on Ukraine. And of course, on the Sunday talk shows, administration spokespersons in Washington were pilloried by forces mostly to their right concerning what they saw to be a defeat for U.S. imperialism. But I think that those huckleberries on those talk shows might want to get used to that kind of retreat and backtracking by U.S. imperialism, because I dare say that what your audience should be looking for in coming weeks and months, particularly before the autumn precipitation in Ukraine, which will slow down efforts on the battlefield, is that Washington will seek to put words in the mouth of Putin and Moscow, suggesting that Russia has been defeated because Russia supposedly was defeated in its alleged effort to swallow Ukraine. And then that'll be a prelude to pulling the rug out from President Zelensky, who, by the way, if you have any relatives in the insurance business, advise them not to sell him an insurance policy, because I don't think that he's too long, not only for this world, but I don't think he'll be able to escape to one of his villas, either in the south of France or the south of Florida, or in other lovely spots for that matter. However, your audience should not be buffaloed by that approach, because it's been clear from February 2022 in the special military operation that the aims included denazification, demilitarization, protection of Russian speakers and other allied forces in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine, and no Ukraine joining of NATO. But the goalposts will be moved, and the United States will claim that it scored a goal because they prevented this alleged swallowing of Ukraine. And I think that that helps to shed light on why you've seen these hairy trips to Ukraine in recent days by Secretary of State Blinken, by the Foreign Minister of Germany, Madame Baerbock. And speaking of Germany, and speaking of the knock-on effects, the reigning metaphor in the world today is the fact that Chancellor Scholz in Berlin is sporting an eye patch. It's not only that you would think that he's trying to live up to Germany's reputation as the ne plus ultra of piratical regimes, but also that it's a reflection of the disabilities of Germany right now as a result of signing on to this misadventure in the Ukraine. Now, of course, we are told that he wears the eye patch because he had an accident while jogging. But whatever the case, his present makeup is an authentic metaphor for what's happening to his country. Because Germany in the 20th century was a pioneer in aviation and rocketry. You might recall that Wernher von Braun, who was a designer of rockets for the Nazis, after 1945, decamped to Huntsville, Alabama, and became a designer of rockets for U.S. imperialists. Germany pioneered in computers. We all know about the reputation of Volkswagen and BMW, for example. And yet, at the recent auto show in Munich just a few days ago, what stole the show? Who stole the show? Vehicles from China. The People's Republic of China, particularly BYD, or Build Your Dreams, which is financed in part by Warren Buffett, which also illustrates the difficulties that Washington is, Warren Buffett, of course, being the Omaha Oracle, the US multi-billionaire, one of the top 10 richest people in the United States. It also illustrates the difficulty in decoupling these two economies, which then brings us to the harebrained U.S. foreign policy with regard to China, just as a digression, where once again, Mr. Blinken and Secretary Raimondo of Commerce and Secretary Yellen of Treasury and Climate Czar John Kerry have all been to China begging bowl in hand, because there's this contradiction in U.S. foreign policy. On the one hand, they want to overthrow the People's Republic of China. On the other hand, they want China to continue to buy treasury bills to keep the U.S. government afloat, particularly since these maniacs in the Republican Party are about to shut down the government in any case. And for how long, who knows, given their obsessions. And so it's difficult to square that circle. That is to say, it's like you trying to intimidate your banker, given the correlation of forces with regard to capitalism. The People's Bank in Beijing is helping to keep the U.S. government afloat, and yet Biden is trying to encircle China, although he denies that he's doing so. So coming back to Germany, obviously signing on to this Ukraine misadventure has backfired, but what do you expect from a country that's been occupied by thousands of U.S. troops since 1945? Which then brings us back to France, because even though you see that President Macron, once again, he's trying to engage in a double game. On the one hand, he's on board with regard to the Ukraine misadventure. But recall the Munich Security Conference at the beginning of 2023, where he was sufficiently farsighted to issue what in the United States political world they call precriminations, not recriminations. In other words, he was already saying, well, look, I went along with this escapade, but it's not going very well. This is early 2023. And I warned you people about this. And now, picking up the mantle, former French President Sarkozy has gone a step further, suggesting that this misadventure is not going very well and France needs to consider evacuating altogether. And so this is not being embraced in Washington, which is all in with regard to this conflict. France and the United States, as noted, are tussling in Africa. France was upset when the United States elbowed France aside and scooped up a multi-billion-dollar submarine deal with Australia, which led to the make-up session with Macron coming to Washington. Interestingly enough, two events happened in the context of that Macron visit. One, interestingly enough, he took the opportunity to visit New Orleans, which some of you may see as mundane. But in light of the fact that the Canadian Foreign Ministry has just suggested that if the United States keeps moving to the right, that Canada will have to reconsider its foreign policy alliance with Uncle Sam. And given the fact that Canada has a historic tie to France, after all, Quebec is still predominantly French speaking. Former leader Charles de Gaulle came to Quebec and egged on secession. Do not be surprised if Canada seeks to reorient itself away from the United States, particularly if Trump is elected, by the way, which will have tremendous ripple effects on the global correlation of forces within the capitalist world, which we cannot sniff at. And then with regard to the other allies, speaking of Britain, the polls do not look well for Rishi Sunak. The Labour Party has an enormous ability to blow elections. I'm not even sure that if they wanted to, and you never can rule that out, that they'll be able to blow this upcoming election and Mr. Sunak will be out on his ear.
You know, Dr. Horne, you mentioned Haiti in passing, and I wanted to mention the Haiti connection with some African states. The U.S. is plotting a new occupation of Haiti. They descended upon the CARICOM summit, sending Vice President Harris and Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader, sending Black people, in other words, and getting African nations to participate in this impending occupation. So Kenya is on board, Rwanda is on board, so that there will be imperialism in blackface, so to speak. Haiti is still under the control of the core group, has a prime minister governing the country who has no legitimacy, who is unelected. And yet we have these nations, also Caribbean nations, Jamaica and the Bahamas, saying that they would send security forces or troops, or whatever they are calling them, to Haiti. What are your thoughts about these developments?
Well, with regard to Kenya, and I'm well aware of these plans to send Kenyan forces into Haiti, and I'm well aware of the demonstrations that have taken place at the Kenyan embassy in Washington, D.C. I'm also well aware of the pressure that's being placed on Nairobi. Recall that President William Ruto was only elected a few months ago. It was a very controversial election. He was not expected to win. The challenger, Mr. Odinga, was expected to win because he had cut a deal with his erstwhile antagonist, speaking of Uhuru Kenyatta. But somehow Ruto was able to prevail. But there have been demonstrations in Kenya, demonstrations against Mr. Ruto, demonstration against the deteriorating material conditions of life in Kenya. And so Mr. Ruto no doubt feels that he has to curry favor with Uncle Sam by agreeing to this dispatching of forces into the Caribbean. However, I do think we should not allow ourselves to ignore the inference of what's going on, which is that Washington, perhaps because of Washington's apprehensions about what progressives and radicals will do, does not feel that right now it's capable of sending its own forces into Haiti. The dispatching of Brazilian forces some years ago did not work out very well either. So perhaps one way to look at what's going on is to give a shout out to the much beleaguered U.S. progressive and radical community, which may have chalked up a victory that we were not aware of. With regard to Rwanda, Paul Kagame, who in many ways is a kind of favorite of the North Atlantic countries for various reasons, after all, he has been cooperating with London in sending asylum seekers from people, coming from Afghanistan and Eritrea, etc., crossing the channel into London, and then London tries to send them to the heart of Africa in Rwanda. That's won him points and plaudits from the North Atlantic countries. I guess that he feels that he's repaying the favor by sending his own forces into the Caribbean. But I think what I would like to see and what I would like to hear is an articulation of a demand that not only should Haitian people be allowed to exercise self-determination, but we also know that since the advent of settler colonialism in the late 15th century, the early 16th century, that Cuba and Haiti have been close as lips and teeth. And despite the fact that Washington is seeking still to marginalize and isolate Cuba and strangle that revolution altogether, that we should demand that Cuba be at the table, along with Haiti, in terms of resolving what needs to be resolved in Haiti, because I think that will have the ripple effect of damaging the attempt to boycott Cuba. It will chip away at the blockade of Cuba. And it will also be a recognition of reality, because many of us fully expect Cuba to get an invitation to join the Brics. I'm surprised, actually, that it didn't happen at the Johannesburg summit. Just like we expect Mexico to get an invitation to join the Brics as well. And of course, the relationship between Mexico and Cuba is probably as closer than the relationship between Cuba and Haiti. And so Washington, I know that it's difficult to give up these demented dreams of imperial hegemony, that once you've been able to bestride this small planet like a colossus post-1945, it's difficult to accept a shrinking and reduced role. But as I often tell the imperialists, in the 1600s, the Netherlands thought it was on the way to world domination. Well, that didn't happen. But Amsterdam is still a very pleasant place to visit, as well as Rotterdam and The Hague. So U.S. imperialism needs to recognize that there is an alternative path to being the world's hegemon, that life goes on as it goes on in the Netherlands. And so they should study that example in order to follow reasonably the path of imperial decline.
Yeah, and speaking of that decline, I was wondering if maybe, I know we have about 15 minutes left with you in particular, Dr. Horne, if we could maybe end on your thoughts on the on Brics, the expansion that you've mentioned a few times here, and the G20. They just admitted African Union. They announced this corridor, a corridor that involves the Middle East. It involves, a corridor to Europe, and it's seen as like a counter to the Belt and Road Initiative. But I wonder if you could speak about, because you mentioned earlier about BRICS, where Russia and China, if we actually reverse the order of the letters and call it crib, it's like China and Russia. They're the big fish. That's great. That's the first time I heard that. So I've actually really appreciate that, because they really are spearheading what is this called this multipolar world, given their importance in the world in so many different areas. Could you talk about this Red Scare 2.0 that I feel like has been drummed up? You've written so much about this, and I feel like what often gets lost in conversations about BRICS expansion, what happened at the G20 just this past weekend, and how Russia and China really are spearheading a lot of these developments and the responses to them. How should people in the United States, in the West, relate? Because you've written so much, from works on Paul Robeson, Du Bois, people who were really part of movements and who related to the correlation of forces globally in a very sophisticated way, to the point where there was always sides being chosen. And you talk a lot about that, I think, in your work broadly, about how people do need to choose sides. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about how people should relate, in the belly of the beast and the vassals that follow along with the belly of the beast, how they should relate to these developments, BRICS expansion, multipolar world, and of course the rise of Russia and China.
Well, I think I heard Margaret mention that many Black American leaders are being dispatched to CARICOM meetings, for example. My question is, where are the Black organizations? Why aren't they sending representatives to not only CARICOM meetings, but to the BRICS meeting? What was interesting about the BRICS meeting in Johannesburg was that there were not only the members, as noted, but there were representatives at the head of state and head of government level from more than a dozen African countries, including Tanzania, Malawi, Democratic Republic of the Congo. President of Zimbabwe would have been there, but for the fact that he was in the midst of a re-election campaign, which he won. And I should mention parenthetically that Zimbabwe is still under sanctions because of land reform. That is to say, having the gumption to reverse the fruits of settler colonialism by seizing land from settlers. Imagine what would happen in Hawaii if the indigenous, the heirs of the regime that was overthrown by US imperialism in the 1890s, sought to reclaim the land from Mark Zuckerberg and Larry Ellison of Oracle and Oprah Winfrey, for example. All hell would break loose. And that's basically what happened in Zimbabwe, which is why they're under sanctions, why their economy has been driven downward. But South Africa, under President Ramaphosa, its internal issues aside, have stood by Zimbabwe to its credit, which then brings more attack from Washington. And then, speaking of contradictions, if you tune into Voice of America, as I do periodically, you will notice that their Southern Africa correspondent, Darren Taylor, is vitriolically and vehemently opposed to the ANC government. And he also happens to be a correspondent for the Epoch Times. I don't know if you folks are familiar with Epoch Times, that lunatic anti-Beijing
Falun Gong, connected entity.
So what's interesting, and of course, in many ways, they're pro-Trump. And so somebody should ask the president at his next, if he holds a press conference, you never know. I thought you didn't like Trump. So why is your correspondent in Southern Africa a Trump placeman? This reveals the sort of contradictions that US imperialism is facing. And once again, it underscores the role that our beleaguered forces can play on this side of the Atlantic. That is to say, we need to take a more internationalist focus. We recognize that historically, movements for progress have been accompanied by internationalism, which then brings us to the Red Scare, which was this hysterical reaction to the growth of pro-socialist forces in the United States. I'm writing a book as we speak about that period, another book, I should say. And it's really, in retrospect, rather astonishing the kinds of strides strides that the organized left and left-leaning trade unions had made in the United States in the late 1940s and early 1950s before the advent of the Red Scare and this maniacal anti-communism, this hysterical anti-communism. And of course, a step towards the Red Scare was the war in Korea, initiated in June 1950. That was really the turning point, because many on the left did not support that war, which allowed them to be tarred as being anti-Yankee, anti-US, et cetera. And I, like yourselves, was quite stunned by that front page article in the New York Times just a few weeks ago, which had the odor of the Red Scare, singling out Neville Singham. I happen to have known Neville Singham's dad, Archie Singham, who was a professor at Brooklyn College back in the day, of course, of Sri Lankan descent. If you believe the New York Times, his son, Neville Singham, is like the money bags of the left movement in the United States. We should be so lucky, in fact. We need more Neville Singhams, if that happens to be an accurate characterization, which I have no way of knowing. But in any event, it led to this hysterical anti-red scare, this anti-red obsession, red baiting. Senator Rubio of Florida says he's going to be investigating, et cetera. We should take this very seriously because we know that with the dying of the light of imperialism on the plains of Ukraine, there's going to be a desperate search for scapegoats, a desperate search for distractions. And what better distraction than as this hysteria about wokeness and cancel culture and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all of these other buzzwords, ESG, environmental, social, and governance that the corporations supposedly are being forced to follow. The turn in country music with regard to Mr. Aldean and his try this in a small town, where he's basically raising the specter of celebrating lynchings, of all things, believe it or not. You would think that he would be mortified by doing so, but no. There is a base for that sort of nonsense in the United States, is reflected in the fact that that song, as the saying goes, has climbed the charts, pardon the expression, with a bullet. And I'm not going to say who that bullet will be aimed at. So we have a very desperate situation faced in the United States. I'm happy to say that this Labor Day, just a few days ago, we were able to mark a number of victories, for example, or victories by those so involved, the UPS Teamsters contract, the United Auto Workers may be going out on strike sometime this week. Tens of thousands of actors and writers are on strike in Hollywood. Tens of thousands, underscore that, face-to-face with big capital, Amazon, Disney, Netflix, because the union movement, one of its weaknesses is that it's disproportionately cited in the government sector, teachers, hospital workers, et cetera, and is in the single digits in terms of membership of representing a private capital, which is the power behind the throne, as we all know. And so we have reasons for optimism, but we should not be wildly optimistic given the correlation of forces in this country, given the fact that the settler colonial regime under which we labor has been based historically on class collaboration, particularly amongst those of European descent who, after all, invaded across class lines hundreds of years ago in order to seize the land of the Native Americans, which has basically taken place, and then kidnap Africans to get them to work for free. But once again, that has a positive because despite the fact that it's rarely recognized, the descendants of the enslaved population are more prone to engage in class struggle, more prone to join unions, for example, more prone to take to the streets as a result of these outrages when we're executed by officers of the state without due process of law. So I guess I'm concluding by saying that there's a mixed bag that we have. That on the one hand, there are severe challenges, not least on the African continent, which is where we began. But on the other hand, we have a reserve. We have pockets of strength. We have a legacy of class struggle, not least amongst the descendants of the enslaved population. We have unions that are on the march. We, in other words, can prevail, but we're going to have to step up our game if that's going to happen.
I'm unmuted.
Oh, you're muted. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Horne. And my last question, you answered some of my question about having room for optimism. Can you talk to those people who may be less familiar with the concept of internationalism and the idea that I get the feeling there are people who hope there'll be some special deal in the United States and we don't have to worry about the rest of the world. But we know as Haiti goes, so do Black people in this country. What would you say as in our last few minutes to those folks who need to better understand the need for internationalism?
Well, first of all, I don't think you can understand progressive change in North America without understanding internationalism. That is to say, what was the trigger that led to a general crisis of the entire slave system that could only be resolved with this collapse? It was the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. That was a victory for the unpaid sector of the working class, speaking of the enslaved, which inevitably led to gigantic strides by the working class in the United States. The struggle for an 8-hour day takes off post 1865 with the abolition of slavery in this country, which is a direct outgrowth of the Haitian Revolution. And of course, now we're poised to make demands, not for the 40-hour week, which comes out of that struggle for the 8-hour day, but for the 32-hour week with no cut in pay. Likewise, with regard to the advance of working people and working class people in the 1930s, with the organizing of mass unions. Prior to the 1930s, the trend was, for example, you go into university and organize professors, but leave the staff and the custodians and the cafeteria workers to fend for themselves. That changes in the 1930s is sparked dramatically by the rise of the Communist Party, which had been sparked into being by the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. If you look at the erosion of Jim Crow in the 1950s, that has everything to do with the fact that Washington is an ideological contestation with the then socialist camp, finds it difficult to win hearts and minds in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia, as long as people of color in this country are subjected to an atrocious racism and white supremacy. This creates a dynamic by which Jim Crow itself begins to erode. Part of the missing link in our struggle today is precisely an insufficient amount of internationalism. Now, of course, we do not lay that accusation clearly at your doorstep. You're fighting the good fight. But as your question suggests, there are others who need to be convinced of this. And I think all you have to do is look at the correlation of forces. Look at what we're facing in terms of this presidential election, the choices that millions of people will opt for in November 2024. It's unappetizing, to put it mildly. This is not some sort of accident. In some ways, it's the logical working out of the contradictions of settler colonialism. And so for those who historically have been at the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid, Black people in the first instance, we recognize that internationalism has been our saving grace. Internationalism has been our friend. And of course, one of the victories for the ruling class was when they knocked the NAACP off course by forcing the NAACP to purge its internationalism, to purge W.E.B. Du Bois, which they did in 1948, to attack Paul Robeson, which they did the following year. Interestingly enough, the NAACP had its annual convention just a few weeks ago in Boston, Massachusetts. I was hoping against hope, silly me, that they would revisit their infamous anti-communist resolution at the Boston Convention of NAACP in 1950. But alas, I was mistaken. Instead, they invited Hillary Rodham Clinton to give the keynote. So we have a lot of work to do. I hate to perhaps end on that rather non-uplifting note, if I can coin a phrase. But on the other hand, that's the kind of sober realism that we need as we continue to march forward.
Indeed. Well, Dr. Horne, it was great to have you. Margaret and I, for everyone who's going to stick around, we're going to be around for another 20, 30 minutes or so, but Dr. Horne does have to leave us now. It was great for you to join. We have your book in the link in the video description, so please be sure to check that out. His newest book, Acknowledging Radical Histories, a series of his interviews, which you don't want to miss. Also, look him up for all of his other books, which are surely informative, especially about the historical roots of the United States. Those tend to be my favorites. Dr. Horne, do you have any parting thoughts about where people can find you?
Oh, well, many of my lectures and media appearances can be found on the usual sites where you go for audio and video. Likewise, there are pages on FB that you can go for my media appearances, audio and video, etc. And then, of course, there are the books, because, I don't necessarily write these books as some sort of finger exercise on the keyboard. I'm writing, hopefully, to educate, to illuminate, to spark change, to catalyze change. And so ultimately, I would point you to what I've written.
Great. And I put the Activist News Network, Mr. Ryan Napoli, I believe, who has worked closely with you, having you on frequently. So you can definitely find a lot of his interviews there. With that said, everyone, that's in the chat. So make sure you find that link. Thank you, Dr. Horne, and we'll be in touch again, hopefully soon. Take good care.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
for
Good
inviting
evening.
me.
Good night.
Good luck.
All right. So Margaret, me
Yes.
and you for another 20, 30 so minutes, everyone. So do stick around. Where do you want to begin? Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to talk about? I don't know. I mean, there's been a lot going on. There's all this talk about Putin and Kim Jong-un meeting, which has some interesting thread points. But I don't know if you have anything that you would like to kick off on.
There's so many things. The UN, I mentioned during our chat with Dr. Horne, the UN meetings, annual General Assembly meeting convenes in New York next week. So there could be some interesting news there. Excuse me, the UN is problematic, though. It's I spoke about its role in Haiti as part of the core group, where they, choose Haiti's leaders, but it is the world's international body. And it will be interesting. Joe Biden goes, most world leaders go. It will be interesting to see what comes of that. I'm interested to see what comes out of his Biden's meeting with President Tinubu of Nigeria, which we mentioned. But there's so much. Ukraine is the focal point, and for good reason. It has been the catalyst for so much change. And I remember our friend and mentor and comrade Glenn Ford saying that everything that the U.S. does to try to maintain hegemony inevitably weakens it. And we have seen this instigating of the Ukrainians to attack the Donbass region and egging the Russians on, who had to make this decision about whether to protect their people or not. You can argue about their decision, but the U.S. wanted this war. Ukraine, those who say you can't make Ukraine have peace talks, they did have peace talks with Russia, but the U.S. and the U.K. talked them out of it. And now, a year and a half later, thousands of dead people, mostly Ukrainians. Europe has devastated its economies, as we've discussed. Germany, as in particular, the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, and we have Seymour Hersh making a very good case that it was the U.S. that did that, but that has hurt Europe very badly. So we see this country that maintains hegemony by punish its supposed ally, Germany, right? Punishing its allies, trying to weaken China and Russia, but not weakening China and Russia, bringing them closer together, and trying to attack China with tariffs about chips. So China just makes different chips, but they hurt U.S. businesses, hurt businesses in the Netherlands, which had a large chip manufacturing process. Trying to instigate African countries to be on the side of the U.S. Meanwhile, people in Africa, in the Sahel region, which we discussed, you see endless images of people with Russian flags. So all of these things are happening now. I'm not sure where to begin, but those are just some of the things on my mind these days.
Well, let's maybe dig into Ukraine, because I think it really does connect to everything. It's kind of like this flashpoint that just has accelerated so many of these global developments and also domestic developments too. One thing that I'm noticing, though, and one thing to look out for, Dr. Horne mentioned this briefly in terms of the US's end game here in particular, but I'm already noticing just in the last week or two alone, the way that the United States is positioning itself vis-a-vis Ukraine now, where you had Blinken go for a couple of days, and on the surface, it seemed like everything was fine, more aid, we're with you forever. But it was a long visit. And right after that, you had the G20 summit happen, and Jake Sullivan, curiously, who's basically Blinken's, second in command, Jake Sullivan curiously praised a statement from the G20's leaders' declaration that completely left out any language that said any involvement from Russia or anybody else with regard to the war in Ukraine. It was just called the war in Ukraine, or the Ukraine war. And all that was said was that all parties involved must follow international law. And I think what's so interesting about that statement is, one, Narendra Modi was the president of this G20 summit, and he has been very famously throughout the conflict very neutral, and has actually strengthened ties with Russia at this time. And the United States has done so much work under Biden to try to kind of scratch Modi's back, bring him to Washington, announcing this corridor, which will involve India, the Middle East, into Europe. Trying their best to pull India into an anti-China, anti-Russia camp. But at the same time, this statement alone, in my opinion, I mean, it's like the neocon foreign policy establishments dominate, no matter which party it is, Democrats, Republicans, they've dominated the United States' foreign policy establishment for so long. And they are now seemingly getting almost like cold feet over the conflict in Ukraine. They want to support it permanently, but it seems like there's acknowledgement that, one, things of course are not going well. The counteroffensive is a flop. By the time it's over, you could have more than 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers dead. I don't know if there's that many left, because I've heard people tell me from behind the scenes that millions and millions of Ukrainians have left the country. Many of them went to Russia, but also, of course, neighboring countries, European countries. So, there's all this talk about running out of weapons, but they're running out of people to fight this conflict. You have women, you have children on, 16 and over fighting. It's like, it's a disaster, and it's not going to get better just because the weather is going to change. Russia is not desperate, even though they're trying to say that Russia has to get weapons from Kim Jong-un. Like, I don't believe that for a second. I believe that if they want to trade if they want to, trade arms, that's 150% their right. But I don't think Russia needs help from the DPRK. It's just one thing after another that shows that there's a real desperation going on. And I think the United States is really going to try to position itself as like the confident loser. Like, we have not been able to get what we wanted, but I think Dr. Horne has a point. He's like, well, we won because Russia didn't achieve its aims. And look, they're already saying it. NATO, Ukraine is closer to NATO than ever. Ukraine is stronger than ever as a democracy, all of this stuff. But at the same time, Ukraine is going to be heavily divided. It was already an economic disaster, and it's going to be even more so by the time this thing is settled in one form or another. It seems like the United States, there's articles in the Western media constantly. This is not going well. This is like, maybe we should have listened to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who only is, one of our top war planners. Maybe we should listen to that guy because he might know a thing or two about when a war is going badly and when it isn't. There's all these articles about these things, and yet you have Biden bumbling to Vietnam and barely able to speak. So it's hard to know if there really is any direction here, or if it's just kind of stay the course and be the confident loser. But I'll kick it back to you.
Well, I think their biggest problem is election year. The U.S. Election season begins in January. That's just a few months away. They know, despite all the war propaganda, all these months of endless propaganda about Ukraine, which is unlike anything I can remember happening in the U.S., most people want the U.S. out. They don't want their money sent to Ukraine. We are always told the answer is no. For anything the people need here, the answer is no. And the U.S. is keeping the Ukrainian economy afloat. People here don't have pensions. Ukraine's pension system is now being supported by the U.S. European nations are out of weapons. They are spent with the weapons that they have given Ukraine. And so it's important to remember, Russia's not fighting Ukraine; they're fighting all of NATO. But the other nations, they don't have the industrial capacity that Russia does, and the U.S. doesn't have the industrial capacity that it used to have. So if anybody's running out of weapons, and it's a funny thing about Biden, sometimes in these outbursts he'll admit the truth. And he did say that a couple of months ago. He said, well, we're running out of weapons. But they've got they have a political problem at home. The Ukraine project is bipartisan. No one deviates from it in the Democratic or Republican Party. Some of the independent candidates and third-party candidates, but that's about it. So they are stuck with something that the people don't want, but that never stopped them before. So it will be interesting to see what happens. I don't think they want to get out. I think they want to escalate. I mean, if you promote Victoria Nuland, that tells me you're not about to back down. So they're going to pretend that it's like the years of the Vietnam War. They're going to pretend they have some new plan, or they're less involved, when in fact they aren't. But Ukraine has given them a domestic political problem that they don't know how to deal with.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think the Vietnam example is apt. I also think the Korea reference, now that there's all of this talk about Kim Jong-un and Putin getting closer, I mean, that's a foregone conclusion. That's been happening for years and years and years. It's only going to continue to happen, especially when the United States is forming like a literal trilateral alliance on China, against China and the DPRK with Japan and South Korea. But this also implicates Russia, because Russia happens to sail its naval vessels through these same waters, and at the same time, it's also facing a very similar situation when it comes to NATO, and of course the sanctions, which affect all three of these countries: China, the DPRK, and Russia. But I think the Korea example is apt in the Vietnam example too, is because while in Vietnam they failed, the United States could not keep the country split. It couldn't maintain any kind of occupation or permanent war against Vietnam. They were fully and wholly kicked out by 1975. Both Korea, what they ended up succeeding in doing was getting at least enough international support in a much different period to keep the country divided and literally only settle on an armistice, which is the exact same thing that the United States and NATO are proposing now. They're proposing a frozen conflict. You could literally just say Minsk 2.0. They're proposing that all sides stop shooting for a little while. And what happened under Minsk when that happened, when it was literally just the Ukrainian government going into the eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, and shooting and bombing and bombing. When that happened, Germany, the United States, France, they came together and said, okay, Minsk Accords, everyone stop. All right. But of course, it didn't happen. And I think that's a similar situation that the United States would really like is, well, when things aren't going well, let's position ourselves. And I think, Blinken, when he was in Kiev right afterward, he said, Ukraine is ready to come to the table, but Russia isn't. And I think that's kind of the framing that they want to keep, that these hawks and neocons, they want to keep up this framing that Russia is the problem. Ukraine is ready. We're all ready for some kind of settlement, which all they believe a settlement to be is some kind of ceasefire for a little while they can. And they literally say this basically every other week in the mainstream media. They'll say, well, maybe 2024, 2025, we'll have enough weapons for them to send another 10 to 15 to 20, 40, 50,000 Ukrainians into, the slaughterhouse essentially against Russia. Like that's kind of the plan, it seems like, because escalation, and I think this is a credit to both Russia and also just the world situation, no matter how many forces within the political establishment in Washington or NATO at large, no matter how much they want a direct confrontation with Russia, and also how much they want to lead to a confrontation with China, as Gerald Horne would say, the correlation of forces just do not support that, because all that would happen is a nuclear catastrophe that would basically end the very system which they hope to basically squeeze everything they can out of for as long as possible. So that plan or that priority kind of goes out the window if you press that nuclear button. But I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, well, you're right about that. Also, Russia's not interested. Russia's winning, so they don't want to hear it. And what happened with Minsk? Nothing. They signed this agreement, everything looks good, and now everybody admits, oh, it was all phony. It was just, we were just given an opportunity to arm Ukraine more. So Russia doesn't want to hear about it. The sanctions have not worked. Russia has survived fairly nicely, despite what did Biden say? We'll turn the ruble to rubble or something like that. But it's the euro that could be turned into to rubble. So and you have Russia and China. So nothing they have planned has come to fruition, and Russia is not interested. There've been I've heard from people who watch these events and are and who are reliable, know what they're talking about. There have been attempts to reach out to Putin. He's not having it. He doesn't want to talk to him. And I understand why, but it's just a terrible tragedy. And to mention Korea, there was a point when they said that war ended with an armistice, with peace talks. A war can end with peace talks. It doesn't have to end because there's more dead bodies on one side than the other. Ukraine is now going to conscript Ukrainians who've gone to other European countries. They've said women up until the age of 60 can be in the army. They are clearly in need of men, of women too. So they've gotten themselves on the horns of a dilemma, as the saying goes. It's hard for them to back down, having gone all in, having said we're going to fight to the finish, to the last person, et cetera, et cetera. Now they have to change that strategy, and it's very difficult for them to do so. Also, they're just not honest. There's no trust. Why should Russia trust the U.S. On Ukraine? So it's very sad, and I think of all the people who've died. most all the young Ukrainians, especially, I think the toll has, although it's always hidden, that number is always hidden from us. But we know the toll on that country has been much worse. And that had there been honest negotiations with Russia about a security agreement, about Ukraine being a neutral state. And this, of course, this argument goes back 10 years to 2013, 2014. But this is what they wanted, but what they got is not what they expected.
No, and I've had, of course, Scott Ritter on this program, and he always says the Ukrainians have fought heroically. They've thrown themselves into the battlefield. They fought to the death. And then we could flip that though and say, wow, so many Ukrainians were basically used as cannon fodder and dupes, duped into a proxy war that literally has nothing to do with the defense of their country. Because if that were true, Ukraine would be acting a whole lot differently. Ukraine would probably be acting a little bit more like Viktor Yanukovych was acting politically, where he was trying to balance relationships and he was trying to do what would be in the best interest of Ukraine, which is to maintain a relationship with Europe and Russia, which would be, because if you don't maintain a relationship with Europe, well, look at what happens to you. If you don't maintain a relationship with Russia, well, you're just basically cutting yourself up from yourself, because Russia's literally right there. So Viktor Yanukovych was doing his best to walk a tightrope. And of course, NATO, they didn't care about the tightrope. Any kind of move toward asserting some kind of sovereign independence is basically death for you. And these plans were in the works. The whole military encirclement strategy against Russia was always going to include Ukraine, because Ukraine is a hugely strategic place and region. So, it's just so damning, I think, that you have so many people who have been thrown into the cannon fodder in Ukraine for this proxy war that NATO literally provoked. No matter what people say, it was provoked. You can see it over and over and over again. There's plenty of facts that back this up. NATO literally has no legitimacy. So everyone who goes crazy for NATO, NAFO trolls and all of these folks, it's like it has no legitimacy. The North Atlantic, the United States and these European countries really have no business militarily interfering, hundreds, thousands of miles away from their borders. They have no business doing what they were set up to do, which was to defeat the Soviet Union. Soviet Union's been gone. So all that is left to conclude is that this is just an instrument to then destroy Russia, a la the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which was to make sure that nothing like a Soviet Union, who cares if it's socialist or communist, nothing strong, nothing independent can come out of Russia. Well, they've definitely lost that battle. that ship has sailed. But at the same time, I think that there is this huge now gap in the reality and the minds of the people driving this policy now. I mean, after Blinken went to Kiev, Zelensky, had a press conference where he said, "Oh yeah, well, Russia really cares about U.S. elections, right? They really want the anti-aid guy to win." And of course, he's probably referring to Donald Trump, but he wasn't going to say it out loud. But when he said that, he also said majority of Americans, they support this war. And literally, there's like a major CNN poll that came out the same month, that says actually the majority of Americans do not support more aid to Ukraine. And if there's any barometer or measure for that, I mean, on the one hand, I was just in Europe, and you can see all of the public luster for the Ukraine conflict, which was one of the most unfortunate parts about traveling through Europe, is you can see how effective it was. Almost like their 9/11. They kind of treated it like that. And so you can see all the Ukraine propaganda everywhere. But in the United States, the one barometer for how people do not give a crap is how the message is not landing. The mainstream media is constantly championing how great this war is and how much it's necessary and how much Russia needs to be, defeated in its aims. But at the same time, you have the same mainstream media polls showing that Americans don't support that. They don't support more money going there. But I'll end there, and I'll kick it back to you.
myself. Yeah, it's, Americans are struggling. It's something that's not talked about enough. You have Biden, talking about Bidenomics, and it's almost laughable. There's jobs growth. These jobs numbers are always phony. They don't tell you anything. They don't tell you what kind of jobs are being created, what income levels people have reached. It's and there's more. Has Biden said anything ever about homelessness, as there are homeless encampments growing all over the country? So people can see through that, and I thought it was funny. I saw I'm still calling it Twitter. Uh, um, a Biden campaign commercial. It's going to be about standing by Ukraine. And I burst out laughing. I'm like, people don't want to be in Ukraine anymore. This is not helping you. But that's where they are, because he can't defend himself. I say to people now who talk about you can't vote for a third party candidate, or you have to vote for Biden because Trump. And my question is, make the case for Biden without mentioning Trump. Can you do that? And no, nobody ever can. And then they make things up. So you have a very unpopular president. I just saw a poll, his approval rating is now below 40%. It's only 39%. That's a guy who's in trouble. But that's a contradiction. They're all in for imperialism, but the impact on the people is something that is not discussed enough, but people don't want it. There will be very little enthusiasm for Biden. It'll only be the dead-ender, blue mega Democrats. And so he's in trouble. And so they will have this phony Ukrainian victory, and who knows what else. It'll be interesting.
Well, before we head out, because I think we're gonna close up soon, but I want to play this. I want to play this video of Biden actually when he was in Vietnam, because I think it goes to show why there would be a lack of enthusiasm. Because unfortunately, we know, Margaret, that optics means a lot in the United States.
Yeah, it does.
A lot of people are not paying attention to the policies, mainly because they don't see them changing. There's not a lot of, it's not like the mainstream media is feeding them a lot of good policy discussion, especially on foreign policy, let alone anything else. There's not a lot of good, even on things like the student loan debacle. I mean, I'm furious about it from all levels, but at the same time, not a lot of good information. You read the mainstream media and they're trying to spin you in circles about how, oh, well, that was okay, but now it's reversed. And here's this other thing you could get, which is literally nothing. And basically, they're not going to tell you you're getting nothing, but they're trying to spin you into accepting nothing. And so I think that's why a lot of people just don't pay attention to policy, because the media literally fails them. But when you look at Joe Biden, and this is a conversation even the mainstream media is having. I saw Chuck Todd Meet the Press or whatever. I literally having this conversation about Pelosi. They're too old. Biden, too old, right? Yeah. There is this optics problem that I think is increasingly people are becoming aware of. And here is Joe Biden. Let me just pull him up here. Let me rewind, and then I'll play this. Here he is in Vietnam. Mind you, this is one of the most important trips of his administration. So for context, he's going there. He's trying to pull Vietnam into an anti-China alliance. He's trying to frame it as him literally just offering stability, and he's not for a Cold War, but he's literally there to try to get Vietnam, one of the most neutral countries on this issue of China versus the United States, to join sides essentially with them. And this is how he sounds during the press conference. It's ridiculous. Here we go.
He may have a game plan. He just hasn't shared it with me. But I tell you what, I don't know about you, but I'm going to go to bed. Yeah, we talked about at the conference overall. We talked about stability. We talked about making sure that the third world,
So he's talking about the G20. He's talking about what happened to the G20. Anyway,
Southern Hemisphere had access to change it. It wasn't confrontational at all. You can
thank you, everybody. This ends the press conference. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cue the music. I mean, I don't know. That doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence. I think he was talking about Xi Jinping,
Yeah.
but they were talking. I think they were talking about how Xi wasn't there at the G20 and their relationship, and there was a lot of questions about, is this a China thing? Like, you're here in Vietnam, like, what are you doing
Uh,
here? And yeah, and he was trying to say no, 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 none of that. We're friends. Me and Xi Jinping are buddies, but I think the real thing, the real problem here is the optics. He said, "I'm going to bed." He's like, "Stop talking." He kind of looks confused. It's not a good look. So it really does. I don't know. It begs the question of how, given the policy blunders, how much trouble he really is in. But to you,
yeah,
Margaret.
I mean, it's kind of sad. It's I believe it's like elder abuse to me for him to be
Yeah.
president of the United States. I'm sorry. I know they decided to go with Biden in 2020. They were very lucky that he won, and but they didn't have a plan B. Apparently, they didn't have a plan to groom anybody else. I don't know what they were thinking. Maybe they were, making it up as they went along. But it's a big mistake for him to run. I suppose it's possible for him to win again, but of course, we don't know who the Republican nominee will be. And the Republicans, if they're smart, they will pick someone who can appeal to some Democrats. And I it's possible for there to be a second Biden term, but I don't see that happening. But this is what happens when the kleptocracy, the plutocracy, the not the democracy, everything but democracy, when they decide who presidents ought to be, and that's who we've ended up with. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah, no, it's that, I think for all of the trouble that Biden is in, it's certainly possible because, Biden is, I mean, he really is their choice. At the end of the day,
Mhm.
even if Donald Trump runs the most successful campaign, given all that's happened to him, we know that it's going to be between him and Trump, unless I highly doubt nothing is going to happen to Trump before the election starts. So it'll be between him and Trump. The optics for Biden are really poor. Trump has his own optics problems that come from a
Yeah.
different, I guess you could say, different side of the political spectrum, and they're different in character. But it really is going to be a battle of who can create any form of enthusiasm out of a situation where there will be none. So it will be literally like a drag to the finish almost. And Biden could surely win it just based
Good.
on his political credentials, not to us as people, but to the elite. That certainly Trump also could win based on that, and also based on the fact that, at any given moment, people may not show up. Voter suppression may actually work out in the GOP's favor where they do it. It really is a game of chicken and cheating, and we'll see. But I think what is clear is no matter what happens, there is this unity between the duopoly
Hmm.
and especially the foreign policy establishment that controls this duopoly at that level. And of course, the bigger corporate interests that drive all of this is we're not going to see much change. And I think what always happens is we see things get worse. So that's where I think people have to be aware and ready and
Hmm.
involved, and to stand up against that, and make a real difference. I mean, personally, I'll say that, like, I support third parties, and I will be supporting Cornel West regardless of all the bluster that's come out
Yeah. Yeah.
recently about him, just because it's important to support third parties, and because when you do so, you are making a real statement against the duopoly and against its war machine and its endless austerity, etc. But I'll let you get the closing word, Margaret, before I give plugs and whatnot.
Well, I agree with you. It's they're doing the hard sell again, propagandizing people. It's your fault if Biden loses. It's Biden's fault if Biden loses. The scaremongering, that's all they have is intimidation, scaremongering, vote shaming. But I think it has less and less impact on the people. But it's going to be interesting. I can't believe we're just a few months from another election year, but here we are. So
Ugh, don't remind me. It's true. It's nauseating.
I
It is.
know, I know.
It gets longer and longer every cycle, and
Mhm.
it's just never. There's no fun in it. There's no joy in it. It
No,
truly is
no.
kind of studying an empire circling the drain politically. But Margaret, okay, so I'm about to put it's in the video description too, but blackagendareport.com, the new issues
Mhm. Yep.
tomorrow. The link is in the video description too for you to subscribe, support. Anything else you wanna plug before we head out?
Yeah, just blackagendareport.com. We're on Twitter, BLK Agenda Report. I'm on Twitter. I still say Twitter, Freedom Ride
Mhm.
blog. And check out Black Agenda Report tomorrow, Black Agenda Radio on Fridays. So thank you very much. Good to see you again.
Yeah, great, great, great. And everyone, before you go, make sure that you hit the like button. You can catch the whole replay after we leave here. So you can catch Dr. Horne's remarks. He certainly gave a very broad, sweeping masterclass on history and geopolitics related to Africa, Ukraine, Brics, you name it. And it's quite brief, actually, which I think is very useful. So definitely catch the replay. And of course, you can support this channel. All the links are in the description for how you can support that Margaret, how you can support Gerald Horne's new book, and of course, how you support this channel. With that said, everybody, good night, good
Good night.
morning, wherever you are, and I'll see you
Peace.
again soon.